React Magic. React Magic.
Well, hey guys. In this video, we're going to be solving forms in React once and for all in 3 easy steps. After watching this video, we're going to have explored a method for implementing forms in any React application that is both highly maintainable and reduces the total amount of work that the developer has to do. We're going to be looking at 2 tools from the community, from the React and JavaScript community, and we're going to be looking at one pattern for integrating these tools with our components in our React applications. So the first tool we're going to be looking at is a Schema Validator. What is Schema Validation? Schema Validation is simply making sure that an object looks like it's supposed to look. In the context of JavaScript, this means checking whether or not an object has certain properties and or checking whether properties within that object are meeting certain requirements. Zod is one such option for validating schemas in JavaScript and is quickly becoming the industry standard within the context of React front-end development. Luckily for us, defining schemas in Zod is very simple and straightforward. First, we create our variable and set that equal to z.object. This creates a new schema, and then we can define individual fields using Zod's built-in primitives. So say we want an email field, we would do z.string. So the schema now checks that there is an email property in some object and whether or not that email is a string. But right now, it's not checking whether or not email is actually an email. If we want to add an additional constraint in Zod, we can chain function calls. So to check whether it's an email, a good option would be to do .regex. So this would make sure that our email field is meeting some regular expression. And then as a second parameter to this function, we can pass a human readable error message. And this would be what ends up getting shown to our user if the validation fails on the email field for the specific reason of it not matching this regex right here. To actually validate some object using the schema in Zod, we just do schema.parse and then pass some object. So this would pass the check because it matches our email regex. But if we were to pass something that doesn't fit that regex by removing the @ symbol, then it would fail. And Zod schema.parse is just going to throw an error whenever validation fails. At this point, you may be wondering, what in the heck does schema validation have to do with forms? Well, let's think about it. What are we doing when we're validating a form? We're basically making sure that some form state looks like it's supposed to look. For example, we might have an email field where the user inputs their email, and we're checking whether that meets some email regular expression, just like we saw in our last example. Or we might be checking for a zip code field being 5 digits long. And then if any of those checks fail, we want to show a corresponding error message to the user. So that sounds a lot like what Zod is doing. And it sounds like it because it's literally exactly what Zod is doing. So it seems like Zod might be a good tool, but we still haven't answered the question of how do we use a Zod schema for our form validation? How do we leverage a Zod schema for checking whether or not our fields are passing the validation checks that we specifies in the schema, and then showing the error message that we specified in the schema as well to the user when those validation checks fail? In comes React Hook Form. React Hook Form is a form state management library. It handles creating and managing all state values associated with a form, such as the user's input, as well as any error messages for that form. Luckily, React Hook Form plays very nicely with Zod. It has what's called a Zod Resolver, which allows us to just pass a Zod schema to the React Hook Form use form hook, and it will use that schema that we defined with Zod in our Zod syntax to check all of the forms fields and make sure that they are passing any validation that we specified for each given field. And then it will also handle showing error messages, showing the correct error message anytime a specified validation fails. It's worth mentioning that React Hook Form has some forms of built-in validation, so you don't necessarily need to pass it a Zod schema or any type of schema. You can use the built-in validation, but I find that the built-in validation is much less flexible. It covers much fewer cases, and it's less intuitive to use versus having a separated schema in something like Zod. All right, so we want to create a sign up form schema. And once we actually create the schema, I won't make you sit through that. It'll look something like this. And I just want to illustrate how much code this is saving us. If we were to implement a function that checked for the exact same things, it would look something like this in vanilla JavaScript. So yeah, so now we've created the schema. Next step is to use it with React Hook Form. To create a form with React Hook Form, you just do const form equals use form. This hook, it's the thing that will contain all of the state for our form and allows us to configure how our form works. To use our Zod schema in the use form hook, we just pass this Zod Resolver, create account schema. So now the form is using the schema that we defined up here for all of the validation down here. It's going to be using the error messages provided by the schema and putting those into the error message form state whenever a certain piece of validation fails. So that's all you have to do to set up your form state using React Hook Form and Zod, right? Now we have a form that is going to be automatically using all of the conditions we set in our schema, as well as the error message that we created in our schema. So this is vastly simplifying the form state management part of things. And just to illustrate how much code and complexity this is saving us from, I'll show you what that would look like if we were manually creating and managing the state without React Hook Form. So this is what the component might look like if we were manually managing the form state. We would have our form state use state call. So this would just be initializing the state and allowing us to update the input values from the user. And then we would have a second use state call, which would have all of the errors. And then we would have some function for validating the form state and then setting the errors on any validation failure. So this is a lot more stuff that we're having to implement. And what I'm showing right here would probably only be a small part of the total amount of form state management, right? So again, all this stuff is taken care of in just this one line of code calling use form. That makes our life a lot easier. At this point, you may be wondering, Isaac, what in the heck are you actually even doing? You haven't built any UI. There's nothing for our user to use at this point. And you'd be totally right, but that's what we're going to do right now. All right, so now we're going to be connecting our form state to some actual components. First thing we need to do is connect our form tag using the handle submit function that gets returned from use form. It works like this. So here we're calling handle submit with an on submit function as its parameter. This on submit function will get called anytime our form is submitted and validated successfully. So if it's not validated successfully, this function never gets called. This handle submit function is React Hook Form's way of being able to take control of form submission and do things like generate errors when the user submits the form. We also need to register individual inputs. One way of doing that in React Hook Form is with the register function that's also returned by use form. Do it like this. All right, so now that we've passed our submission handler and registered all of the individual inputs, our form state and schema are totally hooked up to our user interface. So if we go back over to our schema, we have our validators here. These will get applied to the corresponding inputs because we've called this register function, right? So now React Hook Form is totally managing all of that state. If this form gets submitted, it's going to check using the schema that we created earlier to validate that specific field. And if it fails, it's going to use the error message provided by that schema for that specific validation check. All right, so at this point, we've accomplished a lot with these tools, right? We have our form state being managed for us with React Hook Form. We have our validation logic being implemented for us with the Zod Resolver. But one thing that's not being handled automatically for us is the UI. For example, if we want to render an error message when there's an error with one of these form fields, we're going to have to use this form state object that gets returned from use form and do something like this. So what we're seeing right here is we're conditionally rendering these spans when there is an error message associated with a certain form field, right? So we render this email error message anytime there's an error with the email field. And the message that gets rendered, again, would be populated from our schema. So if they enter an invalid email, we would get this message from our schema being shown here. And this works, but this is pretty ugly This is super repetitive. In our current implementation, we're going to have to implement this for every single input in our entire application. But the good news is there's a better way, and we don't even need a third party library for this. We're creating a UI that's going to automatically display error messages for us based on the React hook form state. We can leverage React itself. To do this, we're going to need to know about the control object that is also returned from useForm, from React hook form. You can think of the control as an object that allows us to interact with the React hook form state directly. The other piece to this is a component that uses that control in order to automatically render error messages. So the way that would work with React hook form would look something like this. All you really need to know is that we have this input wrapper component that takes a control that we got from React hook form up here. It also takes a name, which will be the name of the field. So this would be the name of some field in the schema. This is the validation that's going to get used for this input. And then we're passing that control to this use controller hook call from React hook form. I know it might sound like a lot's going on here, but I want you to keep in mind that we only have to really do this once for our reusable component, and then we can reuse this component as much as we want throughout our application. So down here we have the actual component markup. We have a normal input component. We're passing it the field.value, and then we're passing an onChange prop, which is just a function that's going to get called anytime text changes. And in this callback, we are calling controller.field.onChange. This is going to update the state value within React hook form state. And then below that, this is where all the magic happens. This is where we're conditionally rendering an error message based on the React hook form to manage error state. So this reusable component is basically magically automatically rendering any error messages whenever there is an error present in the error state. React hook form is actually managing that state. And the end result of this is that we have this reusable input wrapper component. All we have to do is pass it a control and a name, and it will automatically connect to the schema for the form that we want. It will use that to validate that field. And if there is an error, it will use that error message from the schema and put that into the error state, which will then get conditionally rendered into this span, i.e., we get a reusable component that automatically handles showing an error message. So we don't have to implement this once in our entire application. So if we go up here, we can replace all of this. And now we're simply passing the control and the field name for each field. So let's just take a step back and remember what all is happening. Step one, we're creating this schema, which is defining how we validate our form and which error messages get shown when certain validations fail. And we're passing that schema to useForm, which is going to set up our component's form state and manage it for us as well. That's step two. And then step three is creating this reusable component that is designed to work with React hook form, which is going to handle rendering any UI for our form field. So now we have this really easy way to add in new form fields. If we want to add a new form field, all we have to do is add that field to the schema. This is going to handle all validation logic. And then we just have to set up a new input wrapper component. And by passing the name of that field, we will assign all validation and error messages related to that field to that component. So this is a really magical thing. We're not having to manage any of this form state. It's kind of managing itself based on this schema. Also, since we've created this reusable component designed to work with React hook form, this component can handle rendering any error messages based on that schema automatically. Adding new form inputs is now easier than ever. It's extremely maintainable. If there's something wrong with the validation, we know to look in the schema file. If there's something wrong with the component, we know to look in the component file. And that's about it. There's only two places it can go wrong. And it's very easy to create forms and extend new forms now that we've set these things up and taken the time to learn these tools and leverage React itself to create this reusable component designed to work with React hook form, which is designed to work with Zod. Yes, that's all I got. Yes, that's all I got. So that's all I got today. This has been the 3 steps for solving forms in React once and for all. Thanks for watching. This has been Isaac Way with React Magic. See you next time.
React Magic. React Magic. React Magic,